On November 6, 1914, a grey dawn hung over the Shatt al-Arab like wet ash. British gunboats sat low in the water, steel backs sweating in the heat. Men climbed down rope ladders into sludge that smelled like river rot and salt. We're told Britain came to open a front in the Great War, as if war is a moral reflex. But the ledger says something colder. Britain didn't invade because it wanted territory. Britain invaded because the balance sheet of empire was drifting toward bankruptcy and the fuel line was the first creditor at the door. The common belief is simple. The Ottomans joined Germany, so Britain struck back. That is the story that fits into a textbook paragraph. But the economic truth is uglier, and it is written in ink that doesn't fade. Britain didn't fear Turkish rifles as much as it feared insolvency of motion. Ships without fuel are floating vaults that cannot open. Armies without supply are unpaid debts that start to riot. When you strip away the flags, you see the core. A modern empire dies when its logistics default. For a century, Britain's power had been a coal-powered miracle. Coal was not just a rock. It was a domestic guarantee, a black insurance policy dug from Welsh valleys and Scottish seams. It fed the factories, heated the cities, and pushed the Royal Navy across oceans. Coal turned Britain into a global lender of violence, able to project force wherever trade needed protection. Coal was security because coal was British. The empire's engines were fueled by home soil, not foreign promises. Now picture the empire at its peak, the illusion of majesty in full costume. London's streets glitter with polished brass and wet cobblestones. Maps are painted pink, vast and arrogant, spanning continents like a hand over a globe. Ports from Gibraltar to Singapore breathe with shipping, and the sea lanes look like arteries under British control. In public, it seems invincible, but beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting because the empire's greatest asset was becoming obsolete. Technology does not negotiate with pride. It replaces it. In the early 1900s, the world's navies began to understand a brutal engineering truth. Oil burned hotter than coal and demanded less labor to feed the fires. It gave ships more speed, more acceleration, and fewer visible smoke trails. It was cleaner, quicker, deadlier. It made a battleship move like a predator instead of a laboring beast, and the men in charge of Britain's sea power saw it, the way gamblers see a winning hand. Winston Churchill, ambitious and impatient, pushed the Royal Navy toward this new fuel. He framed it as modernization, as advantage, as survival. He wanted oil-fired dreadnoughts that could outpace rivals and outfight them. From the outside, it looked like genius. From inside the Treasury, it looked like exposure. Because oil was not British. Oil was foreign. Oil was dependency. And dependency is the first step toward financial suffocation. Here is the economic trap. The addiction that tightens slowly like a belt. Coal had been a domestic asset. Oil was a foreign liability. The moment you build your fleet for oil, you do not get to try it out. You must keep feeding it year after year, war or peace. Your navy becomes a living mouth, and the only thing it can swallow is imported crude. You have traded a secure income stream for a volatile market. You have turned strategy into a contract with the unknown. Debt is not always a loan. Sometimes debt is a supply line. Sometimes it is a dependency that can be priced, blocked, or exploited. Britain's oil dependency was a kind of silent bond issued to the world. Every barrel had an implied interest rate, paid in vulnerability. If a rival could choke the supply, the fleet could not sail. If the fleet could not sail, trade routes could not be defended. If trade routes collapsed, the imperial economy would bleed, and the ledger would go red. So the antagonist in this story is not a general. It is the market for oil, a faceless force that does not care about patriotism. It is the bondholder you never meet, the price chart you cannot shoot, the shipping lane you cannot conjure. Oil is the kind of commodity that turns nations into anxious buyers. And anxious buyers make bad decisions. They overpay, they overreach, they invade. Britain's problem was not just that it lacked oil. Its problem was that it had already committed to needing it. Once the navy chose oil, the empire's solvency depended on foreign wells. And foreign wells meant foreign politics. Persia, Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf. Names that, on paper, looked like distant geography, but on the balance sheet, they looked like the only line item that mattered. This is where the story's noircore takes shape. In a smoke-filled room, men in suits do what soldiers later die for. They write concessions. They buy shares. They secure refineries. They plan pipelines like veins running from the earth to the fleet. The empire's future is negotiated in contracts before it is enforced in trenches. History is not decided by speeches. It is decided by signatures and supply. Long before the British soldier stepped into Iraqi mud, a private gambler was already drilling for the empire's future. William Knox D'Arcy was not a statesman or an admiral. He was a fortune hunter with the patience to lose money for years in exchange for one spectacular payoff. In 1901, he secured a sweeping oil concession in Persia, trading cash and promises for the right to search across enormous territory. It sounded insane to polite investors. The Middle East was not yet oil country in the public imagination. That ignorance kept the price low. D'Arcy's money bled into the desert for years. Equipment was dragged through brutal terrain. Workers suffered disease, heat, and tribal harassment. Drills broke. Supplies vanished. Investors grew nervous. The venture approached collapse. The kind of slow-motion bankruptcy where the dream ends not with a bang but with a telegram. Then, in 1908, the earth cracked open and paid the debt in black liquid. Crude erupted, thick and relentless, like a secret the world could no longer hide. That discovery birthed a corporate machine, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And here is the key shift in the ledger. The British state did not just benefit from this company, it fused with it. In the summer of 1914, Britain bought a controlling stake, making the company's oil a strategic asset, not a private commodity. That purchase was a financial mobilization before the military one. The empire essentially put oil onto the national books and treated its protection as national defense. Think about the scale of that decision. A government buying into a company is not romantic. It is not heroic. It is not even political in the way newspapers describe it. It is a merger. It is a state turning itself into a shareholder with guns. It is the moment the corporation and the empire become one organism, sharing the same bloodstream. When war came, Britain would not just fight enemies, it would protect an investment. Now look at the geography that made this investment fragile. The refinery at Abadan, the pipelines, the shipping routes, they all sat near contested frontiers. Oil had to move through choke points. Rivers and ports became arteries that could be cut. The Ottoman Empire controlled territory across the border, close enough to threaten infrastructure with shells and raids. In London, the fear was simple. A single well-placed disruption could starve the fleet. This fear became policy, and policy became orders. Even before Britain formally declared war on the Ottoman Empire, it began moving forces to the Persian Gulf. This was not the logic of defending India. It was the logic of defending the pump. The invasion of 1914 was framed as strategy, but its true purpose was corporate security. The empire was preemptively guarding its fuel. When the guns finally spoke at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab, it sounded like war, but it was also the sound of a balance sheet being protected. Indian troops, led by British officers, advanced into southern Mesopotamia. The objective looked modest at first: secure Basra, secure the river, secure the oil corridor, and in the opening weeks, the operation seemed cheap. The Ottomans in the south were weak, poorly supplied, far from their centers of control. Basra fell, and British proclamations promised liberation. Those proclamations are always the same. They are the soft language used to mask hard control. We come as liberators. We are not conquerors. We bring freedom. But the ledger never lies. The empire was not there to free anyone. It was there to keep oil flowing to steel hulls in cold northern seas. And once Basra was secured, the immediate financial threat eased. The refinery felt safer. The pipeline breathed again. That should have been the end. A prudent empire would have stopped, fortified, and held the line. But empires are rarely prudent when resources are involved. Oil does something to decision-makers. It turns caution into hunger. It whispers that the real prize is not the corridor, but the source. It suggests that if you already paid the entry fee, you might as well buy the whole building. So the mission expanded northward, and the costs started compounding. This is the descent, the chronological spiral, where every decision creates a new bill. Supply lines stretched like thin wire. The climate punished men and machines. Disease killed quietly, off the battlefield, with no medals awarded. River transport became the fragile backbone of the campaign, and every delay meant higher costs, more exposure, more desperation. The push toward Baghdad became a political fantasy. London wanted a victory to offset the slaughter in France. Newspapers wanted headlines that didn't taste like mud and death. Generals wanted glory. And behind them, the oil planners wanted something even more valuable. The rumored reserves in the north in places like Mosul. Rumors became incentives. Incentives became orders. Orders became graves. General Townshend, ambitious and theatrical, led forces deeper into the country. Early victories created confidence, the most expensive substance in war. Success made the invasion look easy, and easy wars invite reckless spending. But Mesopotamia was not easy. The land was flat, exposing soldiers to fire. The heat was brutal, cracking lips and minds. The rivers were lifelines that could be severed or slowed. The deeper Britain marched, the more it relied on a supply chain it could barely maintain. Then came the moment when the numbers stopped working. Battles around the approach to Baghdad in 1915 shattered the illusion. Casualties mounted. Ammunition and food struggled to keep pace. Medical evacuation failed. Men died of dysentery, malaria, heat stroke, and infection. The campaign began to feel like a company expanding too fast, opening new branches without enough cash flow to sustain them. It wasn't a tactical failure first. It was a logistical insolvency. Townshend retreated to Kut, believing reinforcements would arrive quickly. That belief was a myth of imperial wealth. But wealth is not infinite. Wealth is credit, and credit depends on confidence. When supply lines are long and chaotic, confidence collapses. Kut became a trapped balance sheet, assets inside, liabilities outside, and no liquidity to escape. The Ottomans surrounded the town. The siege began, and with it, the slow foreclosure of an army. Inside Kut, starvation became arithmetic. Rations were cut. Animals were eaten. Disease spread. The air became sewage and sweat. Outside, relief forces tried to break through and failed again and again. Each failed attempt was another installment paid in blood. Thousands died trying to rescue the trapped garrison, and the return on investment was nothing. This was war as a bad loan, where you keep throwing money at a sinking debtor because you cannot admit the loss. When Kut surrendered in April 1916, it was humiliation on an imperial scale. Men marched into captivity, weakened to shadows. Many died on the march north. The empire's aura cracked. And yet the invasion did not end. It could not end, because the oil problem remained. Britain had tied its naval future to petroleum, and petroleum to Persian Gulf security. Kut was a disaster, but withdrawal would have been a confession of insolvency. This is the climax, the default, the moment when the myth of infinite imperial capacity collapses. The empire learned in public that it could be made to beg. It learned that prestige does not feed soldiers. It learned that morale does not replace medicine. It learned that a campaign without sustainable supply is just a slow death. And in that moment, one phrase becomes the key. Sovereignty is solvency. Britain responded the way desperate investors respond. It doubled down. It sent more troops, more guns, more resources, turning the campaign into an industrial operation. Rail lines were built. Logistics were reorganized. The empire treated Mesopotamia like a project that had gone over budget and now required a full restructure. The aim was no longer a quick security mission. It was now conquest with accounting discipline. By March 1917, British forces took Baghdad. Symbolically, it was massive. It looked like redemption. It tasted like victory in a year filled with death elsewhere. But victory does not close the books if the main asset is still unsecured. The oil-rich north remained in question. Mosul, whispered about in geological rumors and corporate plans, was still beyond British control. Then the war neared its end, and time itself became a weapon. Peace treaties operate like final audits. You get to claim what you physically hold when the paperwork is signed. Britain understood that, and it moved like a thief racing a security guard. When the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918, hostilities were supposed to cease. Lines were supposed to freeze. But Britain kept marching. This is the smoking gun moment, the act that reveals the true motive. War was officially over, yet Britain advanced on Mosul anyway. That is not strategy. That is foreclosure. That is liquidation sale behavior. It is a buyer seizing an asset after the closing bell. At Mosul's gates, protests about law and armistice terms mattered less than the empire's internal arithmetic. The brutal logic was simple. We need that oil on the books. Mosul was occupied. The heist was completed. Now Britain held the three pieces that mattered: Basra for the port, Baghdad for administration, Mosul for oil potential. But holding territory is not the same as owning legitimacy. Britain still had to make the theft look legal, and that required diplomacy. Here, the pens return. Deals with allies become the new battlefield. The map is carved not with swords, but with bargains. In backroom arrangements, Britain traded influence and territory like a financier swapping assets. Agreements reshaped the region. Borders were redrawn. Promises made to local populations became expendable because promises are not enforceable when you control the paperwork. The result was a new political container assembled from Ottoman provinces and labeled Iraq. It was not a nation born of shared identity. It was a structure designed for pipeline security and administrative convenience. Inside that new container lived people with their own histories, rivalries, and hopes. They had not asked to be glued together. They had not consented to foreign oversight. They had been promised freedom in proclamations, and now they saw the truth. They had traded one empire's rule for another's management. In 1920, revolt erupted across the country. The occupation faced a new cost curve, one London did not like. Occupations are expensive. They require troops, infrastructure, and constant policing. And Britain, drained by the Great War, wanted the benefits without the bills. That financial pressure shaped policy more than any moral debate. Churchill, now responsible for managing imperial costs, searched for a cheaper method of control. He found it in the air. Bombers, bases, and the promise of terror as administration. Air control was cost-cutting turned into violence. Instead of paying for massive ground forces, Britain could punish rebellion from above. Leaflets, then bombs, villages, livestock, homes. The point was not just defeat. The point was fiscal efficiency. It was a system designed to reduce the cost of holding a resource corridor. The revolt was crushed, and the occupation became cheaper on paper, even as it grew darker in reality. But Britain still needed a facade. Direct rule looked like colonial theft, which would invite political backlash at home and resistance abroad. So Britain installed a king, a local face to hide foreign control. Faisal was selected and placed on a throne, presented as national leadership. Constitutions were written, flags designed, ceremonies staged. It was political theater that served a financial purpose, stabilized the container so oil contracts could endure. Then the final lock clicked into place. Concessions to oil companies, long-term rights, sweeping durations, and minimal local return. The design guaranteed profits flowed outward, while the new Iraqi state absorbed division, resentment, and debt. A nation was born with its most valuable asset already mortgaged. That is how generational damage begins, not with gunfire, but with a contract signed far away. Years hardened into decades, and the architecture endured. Power stayed centralized, Borders cut across old fault lines, and oil remained the prize that invited foreign pressure and domestic strongmen. Later wars did not invent new paths. They followed channels carved by those first decisions. The pattern repeats because the incentive survives. Oil keeps distorting politics, inviting intervention, and turning countries into battlegrounds for external balance sheets. Return to November 1914. Men wade into mud believing in honor and empire, while in London the truth is clear. They guard oil, defend investment, enforce dependency. When navies rely on imported fuel, empires become hostages, making desperate, costly choices. Who benefits on the ledger when the smoke clears?